Hi, my name is Jared Howard, and this is my assignment for protest movements. Today we're going to be talking about three different protest movements in particular: the African American protest movement, the Hispanic protest movement, and the women's rights protest movements. Within each movement, we're going to be discussing the goals, tactics, successes, and failures that they had and struggled with during their movement. The first protest movement we're going to discuss is the African American protest movement. The African American protest movement had many goals. They sought to end racial segregation, end racial discrimination, and to secure federal protections under their constitutional rights and their right to vote. They had many different tactics for doing this. The first of those tactics was the legal tactic, as seen in Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. The second tactic they employed was political pressure and mobilization politically, as seen in various protests and nonviolent sit-ins and other means that they were able to mail flyers out to constituents and grow the African American political base to further their gains in Washington. An example of the success they had legally was Brown versus the Board of Education, which ruled that it was unconstitutional for schools to be segregated and separate but equal. Several successes that they had politically was the Voting Acts Right was enacted, the Civil Rights Act was enacted, and affirmative action was signed into law. A legal failure they did encounter was the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which ruled that segregation was legal. Now, this was later reversed during Brown versus the Board of Education. In the protest movement, there were many successes ultimately in their goal. However, along the way, there were many hiccups and violence ensued. One example of this was the rise of the Black Power movement, iconed by Malcolm X, and the rise of militant African Americans that thought violence was the best way for them to earn their rights rather than have those rights given to them, as they thought, by Congress. The second group I would like to discuss is Hispanic Americans. Their protest movement followed down a similar trajectory as African Americans. They sought to end racial segregation, end racial discrimination, and obtain federal protections of their constitutional rights. In a similar way, they also used similar tactics to go about acquiring those changes. They filed lawsuits against the state. They formed civil rights organizations and labor organizations to consolidate their power in Washington. And they also used nonviolent protests to achieve their goals. Some successes of the Hispanic protest movement were the Menendez versus Westminster Supreme Court case that ended the segregating of Hispanic children from those of white children in Texas, the Hernandez versus Texas case, which provided equal protection under the 14th Amendment for Hispanic Americans. And they also, besides the legal successes, were able to organize labor unions and get the farms workers' right, and they were able to enhance education for Hispanic Americans through the group of student organizations. The final protest movement I would like to discuss is the women's protest movement. Their goals were slightly different than the other two protest movements in that they sought reproductive rights, to end gender discrimination, equal pay, equal rights, maternity leave for women who were pregnant, ending sexual violence, and ending domestic violence against women. The tactics women used to achieve their goals were also slightly different than the Hispanic and African American movements. While they also organized and held marches and protests, they also focused a lot on writing and art and bringing people together through publications and distributions of different publications. Despite women's efforts in their protest movement, they did not achieve quite as much as the Hispanic and African American protest movements. While securing their right to vote in 1920, women still don't have equal pay. Paternity leave varies from company to company. Secured right to divorces for up to 22 to 20 weeks depends on the state you live in. And ending sexual violence and domestic violence has a long way to go. Women still have an uphill battle to win. The war on women is real, with massive cuts to reproductive rights access, proposal to criminalize abortion, and opposition to the Violence Against Women Act. To answer the question of which protest movement was the most successful, I believe that it was the African American movement. They probably fought the longest and hardest out of all three protest movements to date, and they've probably seen the greatest gains from their fight. All the while, they led the way of ingenuity and inventiveness for ways to fight protests and saw the greatest success. That concludes my presentation on protest movements. Thank you for listening and have a great day.